What if I told you that the reason your raised beds keep disappointing you has nothing to do with your soil, your seeds, or your watering schedule? For years, I did everything the garden centers told me to do. I bought the bagged compost. I followed the spacing charts on the back of seed packets. I watered on a timer. And every single season, I'd walk out to my raised beds expecting abundance and find something closer to mediocre. Leggy plants, half-hearted yields, pest damage I couldn't explain. I kept throwing more money at the problem, better seeds, fancier amendments, raised bed kits that cost me a small fortune, and nothing really changed. Then I started paying attention to the growers who were quietly doing something different. The ones with overflowing beds on tiny plots, hauling in harvests their neighbors couldn't believe. And what I found stopped me cold. The gap between their results and mine wasn't about budget or square footage. It was about 18 specific things they were doing, and I wasn't. Some of these I'd never seen in any gardening book. A few of them I actively argued against before I tried them, and at least 3 of them made me genuinely annoyed at myself for not figuring them out years ago. Stick around, because the last secret on this list is the one I wish someone had told me the very first season I ever put a raised bed in the ground. It would have saved me 3 years of frustration, and it costs almost nothing to do. Now, I want to be straight with you before we get into the list, because I know how this sounds. Another secrets video, another promise of gardening breakthroughs. I get the skepticism. I had it too. I'm not an agronomist. I don't have a research grant or a university extension office behind me. What I have is about 11 years of raised bed gardening, a lot of expensive mistakes, and an obsessive habit of studying the people who consistently outperform everyone else in their neighborhood, their homestead, or their community garden. And here's what I kept finding. The growers with the best results weren't using the most expensive inputs. They weren't following the latest trends in gardening content. They were working from a set of principles that most modern gardening advice has quietly abandoned. Principles rooted in how plants actually behave, how soil actually functions, and how a raised bed system actually works when you stop treating it like a decorative container and start treating it like a living, productive ecosystem. Some of what I'm going to share comes from old-school market gardeners who were growing serious volume in small spaces long before raised beds became a backyard aesthetic trend. Some of it comes from the research side, soil biology studies, companion planting trials, yield data from intensive growing systems. And some of it, honestly, comes from my own embarrassing trial and error, the kind that costs you a full growing season and teaches you something no YouTube video ever quite spelled out. Part of me was genuinely resistant to a few of these. They looked too simple, too obvious. Surely everyone already knew this. But the results don't lie, and once you see what changes when you apply even 5 or 6 of these together, you'll understand why I titled this video the way I did. The core principle underneath all 18 of these secrets is this. A raised bed is not just a garden in a box. It's a controlled system, and systems respond to small, precise adjustments in ways that traditional in-ground gardens simply don't. That's the shift. That's what separates the growers hauling out wheelbarrows of produce from the ones who are quietly wondering what they're doing wrong. Let's get into it. Secret 1. Your bed is too deep and it's costing you. Most raised bed guides tell you to fill your beds 12 inches deep. Sounds generous, right? Here's the problem. The bottom third of that depth often becomes a compacted, anaerobic dead zone that roots avoid entirely. Research on root zone behavior shows that the majority of feeder roots for most vegetables operate in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. What you actually need is 8 inches of excellent, biologically active soil, not 12 inches of mediocre fill. When I stopped trying to pack depth and started obsessing over quality in the top layer, my plant vigor changed within a single season. Save your money on fill. Invest it in the top. Secret 2. You're watering at the wrong time and inviting disease. Evening watering feels intuitive. The heat is gone, the water won't evaporate, plants have all night to absorb moisture. But here's what's actually happening. Foliage stays wet overnight, and wet foliage in still, cool air is a fungal disease waiting to happen. Powdery mildew, early blight, downy mildew, all of them thrive in exactly those conditions. Water in the early morning. Your plants use it during peak photosynthesis hours, the foliage dries quickly, and you cut your disease pressure dramatically. I switched my watering schedule and watched a persistent mildew problem I'd battled for 2 seasons essentially disappear. Secret 3. The orientation of your bed is silently limiting your yield. If your raised bed runs east to west, your tallest plants, tomatoes, corn, trellised beans, are likely shading everything behind them for the majority of the day. Orient your beds north to south whenever possible, and plant in height order from tallest on the north end to shortest on the south. Every plant gets direct light. This single layout adjustment can increase effective growing capacity by 20 to 30% without adding a single square foot of bed space. Secret 4. You're not using your vertical space and you're wasting half your bed. A raised bed without a trellis system is only using half its potential. Cucumbers, pole beans, peas, small melons, and indeterminate tomatoes can all be trained vertically, which frees up the ground plane for low-growing crops underneath. This is called the canopy and understory method, and market gardeners have used it for decades to effectively double their yield per square foot. I added a simple cattle panel arch to one 4x8 bed, and went from growing 1 crop in that space to growing 3 simultaneously. Secret 5. Your soil mix is missing the one ingredient that actually feeds plants long-term. Most popular raised bed mixes, even the famous Mel's Mix style blends, focus on structure and drainage. What they underweight is microbial life. Compost feeds the microbes. Microbes feed the plants. Without an active fungal and bacterial community in your soil, you're essentially forcing your plants to survive on a one-time deposit that depletes every season. Top dress with a 1-inch layer of finished compost at the start and end of every growing season. Never till it in, let the worms and microbes pull it down. Your soil gets richer every year instead of poorer. Secret 6. You're pulling weeds wrong and creating more work for yourself. Here's a frustrating truth I learned the hard way. If you pull weeds when they're mature, you're scattering seeds everywhere you step. The rule that changed everything for me is this: weed at first sight, before any flower sets. A weed pulled at 2 inches takes 3 seconds. A weed pulled at 12 inches after it's seeded takes 3 seconds plus 300 future weeding sessions. Deal with weeds in their infancy, and your maintenance time collapses. Secret 7. Spacing charts are designed for average soil. Your raised bed is an average. The spacing recommendations on seed packets were developed for in-ground garden conditions: compacted, nutrient-variable, biologically thin soil. Your raised bed, if you've built it well, is significantly more fertile and structured than that. You can reduce spacing by 25 to 30% in a well-amended raised bed, and your plants will not compete, they'll thrive. Tighter spacing also shades out weeds, retains soil moisture, and increases your yield per square foot substantially. Treat those packet instructions as a starting point, not a rule. Secret 8. You're starting seeds too early and setting them back. I know the excitement. The seed catalogs arrive in January and you want to go. But transplanting before your soil has genuinely warmed, not just air temperature, soil temperature, puts young plants into a state of cold stress that stunts root development for weeks. A transplant put in the ground when soil hits 60 degrees F consistently will catch and surpass a transplant put in 3 weeks earlier into 48 degrees F soil. Get a cheap soil thermometer. It costs less than a bag of seeds, and it will save you more frustration than almost any other tool in your kit. Secret 9. Mulch is not optional, it is infrastructure. Mulch in a raised bed does 5 jobs simultaneously. It suppresses weeds, retains moisture, moderates soil temperature, prevents soil compaction from watering impact, and breaks down slowly to feed your soil biology. The growers I've seen consistently outperform the averages all treat mulch as permanent infrastructure, not an occasional addition. 2 to 3 inches of straw, wood chip, or shredded leaf mulch applied after transplanting is one of the highest return actions you can take in a raised bed. I cut my watering frequency nearly in half the first season I committed to it properly. Secret 10. You're growing the wrong varieties for your bed size. Full-size indeterminate tomatoes in a small raised bed are like keeping a Great Dane in a studio apartment. They can survive, but they're not thriving, and neither are you. Determinate and semi-determinate varieties, bred for compact growing habits, produce comparable yields in a fraction of the space and with dramatically less maintenance. The same principle applies to squash, melons, and cucumbers. Bush varieties exist for almost every crop, and they were developed precisely for intensive small space growing. Match the variety to the space, not the other way around. Secret 11. Your beds need a transition crop and you're skipping it. Between your spring and fall growing seasons, most gardeners leave beds empty or immediately replant the same crop family. Both are mistakes. An empty bed loses moisture, develops a weed seed bank, and degrades biologically. Replanting the same family in the same bed builds up pest and disease pressure specific to that crop. The fix: plant a fast-growing transition crop, buckwheat, radishes, or mustard greens, between seasons. They smother weeds, add organic matter when turned, and break pest cycles. It takes 10 minutes to seed and pays back in healthier fall beds every time. Secret 12. You're fertilizing on a calendar and not reading your plants. Fertilizer schedules based on dates rather than plant signals almost always result in either overfeeding or underfeeding at the wrong growth stage. Nitrogen-heavy feeding during fruiting, for example, pushes leafy growth at the expense of fruit set. Learn to read your plants. Pale yellow older leaves mean nitrogen deficiency. Purple-tinged leaves often signal phosphorus issues. Brown leaf edges can indicate potassium or watering problems. Your plants are broadcasting their needs constantly. Once you learn the basic vocabulary, you stop guessing and start responding. Secret 13. Companion planting only works if you use it systematically. Throwing a few marigolds around the edge of your raised bed and calling it companion planting is like putting a single lock on a house with open windows. The growers who get real pest suppression results from companion planting are using it as a system, interplanting throughout the bed, combining plants with complementary root depths, bloom times, and pest-deterring compounds. Basil and tomatoes, dill and brassicas, nasturtiums as a trap crop, borage to attract predatory wasps. When the whole bed functions as an ecosystem rather than a monoculture, your pest pressure drops in ways that are genuinely striking. Secret 14. You're harvesting too late and telling your plants to stop producing. This one made me genuinely annoyed at myself when I finally understood it. Most fruiting crops, beans, cucumbers, zucchini, peppers, are biologically programmed to stop producing once they've successfully matured a seed. The moment a cucumber goes yellow or a zucchini becomes a baseball bat, your plant receives a signal that its reproductive mission is complete. It slows down. Harvest everything slightly before peak ripeness, consistently, and your plant keeps producing aggressively because it never gets the signal to stop. I tripled my bean yield one season simply by harvesting every 2 days instead of every 5. Secret 15. Your bed edges are wasted growing space. The vertical interior walls of a raised bed, especially if it's 10 to 12 inches tall, represent usable growing real estate that almost nobody exploits. Strawberries, trailing herbs, and small lettuce varieties can be planted in pockets on the exterior walls using fabric or simple pocket planters. The walls also retain heat that the soil inside absorbs. Planting heat-loving herbs on south-facing exterior walls of a raised bed essentially creates a microclimate 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the open garden. Think of your raised bed as having 5 growing surfaces, not 1. Secret 16. You're overcomplicating your watering and undermining root development. Frequent shallow watering trains roots to stay near the surface, where they're vulnerable to heat, drought, and competition. Deep, infrequent watering, soaking to a 6-inch depth, then waiting until the top 2 inches are dry before watering again, forces roots to go deep in search of moisture. Deep-rooted plants are stronger, more drought-tolerant, more nutrient-efficient, and more productive. Less frequent watering also gives the soil surface time to dry slightly between cycles, which suppresses fungal disease and discourages shallow-rooted weeds. Water less often, more deeply, and your beds will reward you dramatically. Secret 17. You're not inoculating your legumes and leaving free nitrogen on the table. Beans and peas have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil, but only if the right rhizobial bacteria are present to form nodules on their roots. In a new raised bed, or in soil that's been heavily amended with non-organic materials, those bacteria may simply not exist in sufficient numbers. Rhizobium inoculant costs about $3, takes 30 seconds to apply to your seeds before planting, and can increase legume performance and soil nitrogen levels for subsequent crops by a measurable margin. It is the cheapest high-return input in raised bed gardening. Most gardeners have never heard of it. Secret 18. You're treating each bed as separate when they work better as a system. This is the one I wish I'd understood from the beginning. Individual raised beds managed in isolation will always underperform raised beds managed as a rotation system. Each bed should have a role in a cycle, one in heavy feeding crops this year, one in legumes to restore nitrogen, one in root vegetables to break up compaction, one in a cover crop to rest and rebuild. When you plan across beds rather than within them, your soil health compounds year over year. Your pest cycles break. Your inputs drop. Your yields climb steadily without you spending more money or more time. The garden stops being a series of individual problems and starts behaving like a productive, self-sustaining system. That's the shift that changes everything. Before we get to the bonus, I want to take a moment here, because everything I just shared only sticks if you're willing to look honestly at some patterns that most of us brought into raised bed gardening without even realizing it. No judgment, I did every single one of these myself. The first pattern is treating your raised bed like a container, not a system. Most of us start raised beds the way we'd start a potted plant, fill it with something, put plants in it, water it, hope for the best. The raised bed gets managed reactively. Something goes wrong, we respond. Something dies, we replace it. A pest shows up, we reach for a spray. The growers who consistently outperform everyone else have made one fundamental mental shift. They manage their beds proactively, as a biological system with inputs, outputs, and a compounding logic. The soil is not a medium to hold plants. It is a living entity that either gets richer or poorer depending on what you do each season. Once you see it that way, almost every decision you make about your beds changes. The second pattern is chasing yield instead of building capacity. There's a version of raised bed gardening that's essentially an annual arms race: more amendments, more fertilizer, more intensive planting, more everything, trying to extract maximum output every single season. And it feels productive. But what it actually does is deplete your soil biology, create dependency on purchased inputs, and leave you starting from scratch every spring. The growers with the most impressive long-term results are the ones who invest one season in building cover crops, compost, rest, rotation, to unlock 3 seasons of exceptional harvests. Patience in a raised bed is not a passive virtue. It is an active strategy. The third pattern is copying techniques without understanding the principle behind them. Companion planting without understanding which pest you're targeting. Mulching without understanding soil temperature and moisture dynamics. Trellis systems installed without understanding how the plant actually wants to climb. Technique without principle is just imitation, and imitation breaks down the moment your conditions differ slightly from the person you copied. Every secret I shared in this video has a mechanism behind it, a reason it works. When you understand the reason, you can adapt it. You can combine it with other principles. You can troubleshoot when something doesn't go as expected. Gardening knowledge that lives at the level of "do this" is fragile. Gardening knowledge that lives at the level of "here's why" is compounding. The fourth pattern is underestimating how much small adjustments matter in a controlled system. In an in-ground garden spread across a large plot, individual errors get absorbed. The system is forgiving because it's vast and variable. A raised bed is a concentrated, controlled environment, which means it's highly responsive in both directions. Small mistakes compound quickly, but small improvements compound just as fast. Getting your watering depth right, matching your variety to your space, harvesting on the right schedule, none of these feel dramatic in isolation. Together, applied consistently across a full season, they produce results that genuinely look like a different gardener is running the beds. That's the reframe. Your raised beds are not failing you. They're responding perfectly to the inputs and decisions you've been giving them. Change those, and the response changes too. All right, I promised you this at the start, and here it is. This is something I've never seen laid out clearly in any raised bed gardening guide, any book, or any video I've come across. And when I tell you what it is, your first reaction is probably going to be the same as mine was. That's it. Stick with me, because the simplicity is the point. The secret is this: water your raised beds deeply the evening before you transplant anything. That's it. The night before every transplant, tomatoes, peppers, brassicas, herbs, anything going from a start into the bed, soak the bed to a full 6-inch depth and leave it overnight. Here's what that does, and why it matters more than almost anything else in the transplanting process. When you move a seedling from its tray or pot into your raised bed, you are severing a significant portion of its root hairs, the microscopic structures responsible for water and nutrient uptake. That transplant is immediately under stress. Its ability to take up water is temporarily compromised at the exact moment it needs water most to recover from the shock of being moved. If it goes into dry or even moderately moist soil, that stress window extends. The plant stalls, sometimes for days, sometimes for over a week. You've seen it, the transplant that just sits there looking limp and miserable for the first 10 days while you wonder if it's going to make it. But if it goes into soil that is deeply, uniformly saturated, not soggy, not waterlogged, but genuinely moisture-rich all the way through the root zone, two things happen simultaneously. First, the plant can passively absorb moisture through its damaged root system with almost no effort, buying it time to regenerate root hairs. Second, the moist soil makes physical contact with every surface of the root ball more effectively, eliminating the air pockets that dry or loosely settled soil creates around transplanted roots. The result is a transplant that establishes in roughly half the normal time. I started doing this consistently about 4 seasons ago after losing 3 pepper transplants in a single week to what I now recognize was transplant stress compounded by dry soil conditions. The following season, using the same varieties, same bed, same transplant size, but pre-soaking the night before, I lost 0. Every single one established within 4 days and was visibly growing within 10. I've since recommended this to every gardener I know who complained about struggling with transplants. The feedback is consistent. It works, it's free, it takes 2 minutes of extra planning, and the results are immediate enough that you notice them within the same week. The soil is already doing everything it needs to do. You just have to give it the conditions to do its job at the moment your plants need it most. That's the kind of quiet, unglamorous, completely free wisdom that doesn't make headlines, but it saves your garden in ways that expensive amendments and fancy techniques simply can't replicate. That's what 11 years of raised bed gardening and a lot of expensive, humbling mistakes eventually taught me. Let me bring it all together quickly. Your beds are a controlled system, and controlled systems respond to precision. Orient them correctly, and every plant gets the light it deserves. Build your soil biology first, and your inputs shrink every season after. Match your varieties to your space and stop fighting the bed. Harvest on schedule, and your plants never get the signal to quit. Rotate across your beds as a system, and your soil compounds in health and productivity year over year. And the night before every transplant, soak the bed. Give your plants the one thing they need most in their most vulnerable moment. None of this is complicated. None of it requires a big budget or a large plot. What it requires is understanding why your beds behave the way they do, and making small, deliberate adjustments that stack on top of each other season after season. That's what separates the gardeners who are quietly hauling in extraordinary harvests from the ones still wondering what they're doing wrong. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which one of these 18 secrets are you trying first this season. Or if you're already using one of them, tell me what changed when you did. I read every comment and I genuinely want to know what's working in your beds. If this video shifted how you think about your raised beds, hit subscribe. I put out deep dives like this regularly, and there's a lot more where this came from. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now go check on your beds. I'll see you in my next video.